Is geopolitical enlargement real? Are the security concerns of EU candidate countries sufficiently acknowledged in the renewed enlargement policy? Or is EU enlargement still a fair-weather process? Today we'll reflect on these questions with Professor Giselle Bosse, full professor at Maastricht University, visiting professor at the College of Europe, and a fellow at European Democracy Hub. She is a leading expert on EU democracy support, Eastern Neighbourhood and European security. My name is Mariam Khotenashvili, and I'll be your host today. Giselle, it's really so nice to have you today with us.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too and see you today.
Well, we hear so much about geopolitical enlargement, but what does it actually mean? Do you think there's tension between the notion of geopolitical enlargement and a long-standing principle of merit-based process?
Now, geopolitical enlargement sounds as if it's something very new. Everybody's also talking about it these days. The policymakers talk about it. The EU talks about it. Ursula von der Leyen talks about the EU having to become more geopolitical. And there is almost an explosion of academic articles and think tank articles on the topic. But I think it is important to remember that geopolitics, in my opinion, has been part of enlargement almost from the very beginning. Right? If we look at the first enlargements, also, for example, to Portugal, to Greece, these were, moves to stabilize countries that came out of dictatorial rule. And then, of course, the so-called Big Bang enlargement in 2004. Officially, that was the justifications were a lot about. This is about spreading democracy, and of course also economic arguments were brought forward. But essentially, and certainly also for all the countries from Central Europe joining, this was essentially also a geopolitical move. After the end of the Cold War, it was about anchoring their security in the European security architecture, and of course, very importantly, all this was taking place under the shadow or at the same time as NATO enlargement as well. So I would say, this is enlargement has always been geopolitical. It is just that now, of course, in a changing global order with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, already starting in 2014, but of course specifically then the full-scale invasion in 2022. I mean, that is really when the discourse at the narratives at the EU level very much changed. So we now very explicitly talk about enlargement serving also the security interests of the European Union.
Is there really more to the geopolitical enlargement than the 2022 decision to open the door for EU membership for Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova and revive the idea of enlarging to the Balkans? I ask because looking at the negotiating framework for Ukraine, but not only, it's very strong on democratic fundamentals and acquis compliance, but it also requires unanimity at some 40 or 50 stages of the accession process. So it seems to me that while claiming to be geopolitical, the EU in practice does not give a lighter treatment to the new candidates, not even those fighting a war in defense of whole Europe. In fact, one could argue that if anything, joining the EU has become more difficult than it was in the previous decades. In the early 2000s, after countries fulfill the conditions, they could join. Today, if a candidate country fulfills the conditions, if all current member states accept it, and if the disruptive forces don't win, including by military force, then only accession can happen.
So I think in some way it's very understandable, of course, that the EU's acquis has evolved over time. So it's becoming, the EU has become more integrated, more policy areas are integrated, so more policy has to be adopted. At the same time, we have a new, or revised enlargement methodology, and that includes the fundamentals, and that is of course usually considered a good thing, and that we're paying more attention to fundamental rights, functioning of democratic institutions in the enlargement process. But then, as you very rightly say, of course, the process has also become more intergovernmental in the sense that member states have more veto points now than they ever had. And on all the chapters, there's even up on the Commission initiative or any member state initiative, chapters can also be reopened, even though they were already closed, or the process can be reversed. So this is something that is very new. And all these different logics, so we have this geopolitical logic, we have the merit-based logic, also the normative logic, linked very much to the fundamentals chapters. They don't nicely sit together, right? And this is very clear, and you earlier also asked about these tensions. I would argue they've always been these tensions in the enlargement process, also the Big Bang enlargement, the admitted countries arguably before they were fully ready. When we're looking at Romania, for example, or Bulgaria, who joined later, I mean, there were loads of discussions about this, and also the other member states that were joining. So it is the focus on where do we put the emphasis is important, but there is that makes it, of course, difficult in another respect is that member states all have a different weight or put a different weight on what now matters. Is it the geopolitical enlargement? Is it the merit-based enlargement? And on top of this, there's even different ideas of member states. What is geopolitical, right? What is the most important threat that we are facing? How do we have to react to this? How urgent should the reaction be? And how fast should Ukraine be included? To what extent?
Yeah, the problem being that time doesn't wait.
Exactly. And merit-based, which is also very interesting. There's been research by my colleague in Leiden, Antoaneta Dimitrova, and they are asking all the different member states representatives how they understand merit in merit-based. And it is perplexing as how many different definitions you arrive at. And of course, most prominently, the Franco-German interpretation that merit-based is not only about the progress or the candidate countries meeting the criteria, but it's also about the EU having the absorption capacity.
Right.
And of course, if everybody operates all these different understandings of geopolitics and of merit in merit-based, and this is complicating the story significantly for the candidate country.
And the credibility of the European Union's promise.
That too.
Well, if the EU really, really wanted to act geopolitically, could a solution not be to move from the strong pre-accession conditionality to more, stronger post-accession conditionality and post-accession discipline? I mean, potentially, this could ensure that both new and the old member states could keep democratic standards and healthy fundamentals while not delaying enlargement endlessly. And the EU enlargement process would also become kind of less vulnerable to Russia destabilizing the EU's neighborhood. So how do you look at that?
I think in theory, this is a very good and I think would be a very practical idea. Just the reality, of course, of the situation is that we have states joining the European Union, and also, in fact, existing EU member states who are not, starting a process of democratic backsliding. Right, so that is one significant problem, and we have also seen, and still witness this right now, in the context of Hungary, in the context of Slovakia, and earlier also when the Peace Party was leading Poland still, and who knows what the situation will come now with the new president. But the EU's instruments to respond to this democratic backsliding are not functioning properly. It has instruments like the cooperation verification mechanism. It has Article 7, right, the so-called nuclear option, to take away the voting rights of a member state. but it's not using them. And we have seen this time and again. Also, when it comes to blocking financial assistance or programs, assistance programs to member states. Also here the EU has done sometimes use this, but not on a very large scale. So the sanctioning mechanism doesn't work. And that's, of course, is a serious problem for the post-accession conditionality. We simply, there are instruments, perhaps not the most effective ones, but even if they are there, they are not being used. And
Is
this
there a
is
reason
tricky.
for that?
No, that's a good question. I think there is an ethos still in the European Union that, of course, once upon a time, all the countries in the European Union were more or less law-abiding, and that was, that was the modus operandus in that context. But now, of course, we see a set of government that are clearly not so interested in keeping up with the rule of law and democratic standards. And that's something the EU has to digest, because in its very mechanisms, it doesn't really exist as a possibility. It has these instruments externally to foster democratization to some extent, right? And so, of course, enlargement, and that's where the pre-enlargement conditionality comes in. That still remains, in my opinion, a really important incentive and point of pressure for reform, which makes it still very important.
Right.
As an emphasis in the enlargement process. But so there the EU has developed mechanisms, and enlargement has been the most potent mechanism, right, to ensure compliance with democratic principles and the rule of law.
But talking specifically about Ukraine, do you think that a country under martial law, just fighting for its sovereignty and defending the entire Europe, is in a position to adopt and fully implement full EU acquis, for example, on social and employment policies or transport legislation? Couldn't part of the legislative alignment happen once the country joins the European Union?
Yes, this is a very important question, and I think it's also something, or no, I don't think it is for a fact, the possibility of having derogations and transition periods is an integral part of the negotiation frameworks, and then also with Ukraine. The EU, of course, knowing how it conducted negotiations in the past, is not particularly keen in granting these derogations and transition periods. However, in the case of Ukraine, one would hope that in certain policy areas, and just to name a few, I mean, it's also about state aid, it's in the agricultural sector, it's also partly some parts of competition policy. And you mentioned transport is also a very important area where, of course, infrastructure is destroyed, right? And then to implement various safety standards, related to transport. Just to give a random example, right? This is technically and very, very difficult given the state of destruction. And the same with agriculture and then implementing safety, food safety standards and so on. So one would hope that the EU takes this into account and doesn't stay in this mode of how it usually does trade negotiations and then by extension also enlargement negotiations, which is very hard-nosed and showing, well, we are the economic power, we have the leverage. But that there is a bit more mutual understanding.
Yeah.
So that I very much...
And I think they do have an understanding of that. When we speak to EU officials, they say, well, negotiations are a bit of a misnomer. So they're absolutely aware.
Yeah, but it's the EU itself also, of course, wants to have transition periods when it comes to cohesion funds and Ukraine's participation in those, of course, also agricultural policy. So it would only be fair, I would argue, on Ukraine and of course, but at the same time, and maybe that's the last point, still, I think it's very important to keep nevertheless the focus on democracy and human rights and the fundamentals. And again, under martial law, this is not as straightforward for obvious reasons. I mean, elections cannot be held, and there has to be, security when it comes to access to parliament and information and so on. But still, that it is important to keep an eye. Corruption is still a very serious issue in Ukraine, and that also is about raising or increasing Ukraine's resilience also to Russian influence. The more corruption there is, the easier it is potentially also, of course, for Russia to influence political development and economic development. So the fundamentals, I would say, there shouldn't really be many compromises. But for the rest, I think that one should have a bit more flexibility.
Do you think that the EU sufficiently differentiates between pluralistic democracies like Ukraine despite the war and candidate countries with authoritarian tendencies like Serbia? Should the EU be equally demanding towards the candidate countries when one behaves very differently towards the European Union than the other?
No, absolutely. Look, if the EU says, and that they repeat constantly, this enlargement is a merit-based process. So if we stick to this, that also implies that we apply the same criteria to all the countries. Right? Of course, there are some differences in some presidential systems or parliamentary systems. Okay, but that's not what I'm talking about. So that is important. But then, of course, how do you square this with your newly found or reinforced geopolitical posture?
Yes.
Where you're interested, in the case of Serbia, for example, in lithium and critical raw materials, which basically all the EU's actions towards Serbia in this particular lithium case have been running counter any of the democratic principles, working with civil society, consultations, etc., that you can possibly imagine. And of course, this is strengthening a democratic backsliding regime. And this creates what we mentioned before, that creates tensions, of course. So I would say, if we say the enlargement process is merit-based, then, and again, when we focus on the fundamentals and make them non-negotiable, that is, for me, the only way that the process can keep a credibility overall, and that the EU also keeps a credible actor. And I think the EU has the leverage also in the case of, again, of Serbia, where it can put or could have put much more pressure, I would say, for the government to adhere to what are open and transparent procedures when it came to the companies that were chosen for mining and so on and so forth. I mean, just as one example. So this is, the EU was not helpless in this case. I would argue it would have been perfectly able to combine a strategic interest with more pressure for democracy.
Why do you think they're not doing it?
This is a good question. I think sometimes it's a lack of political will. Sometimes it's the urgency that we are talking about. The EU has been in emergency mode for quite some time now, and recognized, well, we need critical raw materials. We can't be so dependent on China, for example, for these critical raw materials. Usually, critical raw materials are in countries or contexts that are authoritarian. So I think here there was a bit of a rush, perhaps. And again, I would say there's a political will, and in the Western Balkan countries, the EU has already a history, of course, of supporting stability, rather than, say, democratic, inclusive governments.
Giselle, do you think that the security of the candidate country, so the security dimension, is sufficiently acknowledged in the renewed enlargement process? In previous round of accession of Central and Eastern European countries, NATO accession preceded EU accession. Now, today, Ukraine's joining NATO seems to be off the table. How does that change the way we should be looking at EU enlargement?
No, I mean, you make a very important point. It is the divisions of the past, of who does what in this enlargement process was clearly out. It's NATO is security, and the EU does the political, the democracy, the economic reform part, and that worked very well. However, now there's a completely different situation. And that puts the EU in a difficult spot, because I think in order to go ahead with enlargement, it needs to take part in a context of security guarantees.
Indeed.
Right? And the strongest security guarantee is, of course, NATO or NATO membership, but that is off the table. And the EU at the moment, and we'll probably also discuss it in more detail later, is simply not in a position in terms of capabilities, but also political will, to offer similar security guarantees. And I think and even NATO in itself and the credibility of its of the organization as a collective defense organization also suffered greatly. So in this context, that puts a lot of responsibility on the European Union. And I think they're probably trying, in the way that the European Union works. They have tried to offer various agreements, of course, security agreements with Ukraine, where it's formal agreements, to offer military support on a longer term basis, but these are not legal agreements, right? And at the same time, then the EU simply doesn't have the kind of military capacities at this moment in time to match the US. So I think could be more commitment, of course, and again we might discuss this later, in military terms, that the EU could offer more in support, military support for Ukraine, also through quicker decision making, but in the end there's limitations.
But do you think that EU enlargement can actually happen in practice if the EU does not find this political will and strength to actually offer concrete security guarantees and security assistance to Ukraine?
I think it just lacks the capabilities. It's defense industries. I mean, the whole picture of it. It's fragmented. We simply, we lack advanced weapon systems that the US offers, nuclear capabilities. Right? Certainly, we can't match that of the US. So even if the EU wanted to, I think offering the kind of security guarantees that the US does now, has done through NATO, I think it's literally impossible at this moment in time.
If the EU and UK want it?
Yeah, sure, of course. But the French have already excluded sharing their nuclear capabilities, but they have started to talk about it, right? Shall we, have a joint, or work on a joint nuclear umbrella, where, of course, the French are still in charge, but the others would also pay for it. But this is all very, very unclear. Yeah, you also know the efforts of course, of the UK and other countries to send a kind of peace troops to Ukraine, and there to watch over potential ceasefire agreement, but this is all very, very unclear, and this is the question right now. I mean, if it's hypothetical, because when is Ukraine really likely to join the European Union? When is it ready? I mean, if it's merit-based, we're still talking about, what was it, 2030, somebody indicated repeatedly as a thing, also EU officials. But what will the situation look like then? Of course, military capabilities, if I'm looking also now at decisions that are likely to be made at the forthcoming NATO summit, the EU is seriously increasing its defense capabilities. And 2030, I mean, this is also rather soon. It's in 5 years. So I don't think that we are ready quite yet then to match the US capabilities. But to come back to your question, if Ukraine was to join the EU, and then there would be potentially, another attack by the Russian Federation. I mean, imagine we have a ceasefire by then.
Yeah.
Even then, the situation is as such that the EU would not be fully capable of responding by itself to such an attack. Would it be able to fully defend Ukraine in 5 years' time with the capabilities the EU is developing? I would question this. Without the US, I would question this.
This brings me to the question that some European citizens are afraid that Russia's war against Ukraine would spill over Europe, and that enlargement would bring more insecurity to Europe than security. What would you respond to them?
Now, I think the fears by the citizens are to be taken very seriously, right? And they are also, they are not unfounded. Of course, when you watch the news, they are seeing the world around and all the conflicts and so on and so forth. So I would say we have to carefully listen to what exactly also the concerns are in the security area for citizens. But what one can respond, and of course one should here respond possibly in the context of each individual member state with different sorts of arguments. But I think what is important to keep in mind is that Ukraine is not only a security taker or consumer of security, as it may look now in the eyes of the citizens, because we are giving military aid and so on and so forth. But eventually, Ukraine is also going, or is already to some extent, a provider of security. And we're looking, at its defense industry. It's also located, of course, in an area where it is going to play, or still already does, a crucial role in the eastern flank of the European Union, if I can then put it this way, and certainly of NATO and in NATO. And it will always take the brunt, if there are attacks, if there are geopolitical conflicts, because it will always remain the closest neighbor of the Russian Federation. And I think what we should also take into account is then, in security terms, the costs of non-enlargement in this context. Of course, this is a bit more abstract, so a bit more difficult to understand. But if the countries that where Russia seeks or considers it to be in the so-called sphere of interest starts to have more influence in these countries, of course, that brings for the EU more challenges even closer by its current border, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that is, that is an instability. But it's across the entire eastern borders with the Russian Federation. That is, I think, puts the EU in a much more vulnerable situation. But I think what I should also emphasize in this context is that what I mentioned before was the two different perceptions or definitions of geopolitics.
Yeah.
I sometimes have the impression that certain member states and EU officials see Ukraine. I mean, they don't openly say this, but it's the perception, okay, Ukraine and now our engagement with Ukraine is not necessarily for enlargement and membership, but it is more for the creation of a sort of a buffer zone. Right? So we're keeping Ukraine armed in order to defend itself against the Russian Federation, and this takes place in the broader accession process. It's a geopolitical enlargement process where, however, the end goal of enlargement is not actually the goal anymore. Right? It's more of a, Ukraine is a tool, for the EU to create this sort of buffer zone. Again, I mean, this is a word that the EU doesn't use. But, sometimes when I hear, this being a strategic investment and so on, I always have the feeling, okay, it's about the EU defending its, or pursuing its own strategic interests, but not necessarily together with Ukraine. Right? It is, that Ukraine is there and it's a tool to achieve this, but it's not necessarily, going all along with including Ukraine in a collective security type of arrangement. It's not necessarily saying, well, then we include you also, in all the decision-making processes of the European Union and so on and so forth, because this only comes once whenever there is EU enlargement. But in the meantime, it's a little bit this idea of forever enlargement. And we've seen this in the Western Balkan countries already, where the EU, offered this membership perspective, but with the goal of stability, and not necessarily about what is this last step, is to include the countries, is to involve them also in the decision making of the EU, to take decisions together on European security architecture. And I'm sometimes a little bit worried that this aspect starts to prevent. It's also very short-sighted. As we've seen in the Western Balkan countries, ultimately this leads to frustration.
But it's
in the
also
candidate
probably
country.
quite unrealistic right now to keep Ukraine as a
Yeah.
buffer zone.
But I'm just saying, I mean, it functions as long as it's not a full member of the European Union. You could argue, again, as the EU doesn't use these words, but you could argue that it functions then as a as a zone where the interests or security strategic interests of the EU can be protected. But that is not necessarily by seeing Ukraine as an equal partner.
And do you think these voices are prevalent here in Brussels or more in EU member states? Both? How much should we be worried?
Well, I hear a lot about strategic investment, but I never hear about the end point of making the process easier for Ukraine to join. Because then we come back to this very merit-based argumentation and so on and so forth. So,
well, which leads me to my next question, which is, do you think that the EU actually and its member states actually see Ukraine and enlargement in general as an opportunity or as a charity?
I very much like this question. I think in the EU's discourse, we have heard more about enlargement being important for security reasons, right? It's also an economic opportunity, although this narrative is not as strong. But immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was much more talk about needing to support Ukraine in humanitarian terms. Right? There was much more of this narratives on charity. However, that was a discourse that very quickly subsided, I would say, at the EU's level, at the member state level, but it continued at the level of the citizens, the population. So popular support, I would say, to this very day, still very much draws on this notion of wanting to support, and I'm saying this on purpose now, say the poor Ukrainians. We've all seen the pictures, and that there's a humanitarian crisis, and the children and the women, and and I'm emphasizing this. There's nothing wrong with these notions of feeling it charitable, and then also donating. However, this is always something that is a controversial way of supporting a country, because it's a very hierarchical way. It's a very top-down approach. I mean, the people who are more familiar with neo-colonial theories, they will know exactly what this is about. But it doesn't see Ukraine as a country as an equal. In no way. I mean, this is always they deserve our charity, and then they also have to behave accordingly. We just I remember President Trump, when Zelensky was sitting there. I mean, this very famous scene, and the first thing he said, "You have to be thankful." Yeah, and this is this very controversial, detrimental logic of approaching Ukraine as a victim, as a deserving recipient of our benevolent aid, but this is leading nowhere, right? And it's also not treating Ukraine as an equal partner in our security
and it's also
architecture.
Underestimating the threat of Russia.
That's certain, that too. And what I would suggest then is a different notion, and this is one of solidarity, because solidarity is very distinctly different to the notion of charity, because solidarity means, well, we are all here in Europe, with Ukraine as an equal partner, as a, not just as a consumer of security, but as a provider of security. And this is also, coming back, what can we tell the citizens? So they can also say, of course, Ukraine and Moldova, by the way, also contribute, of course, a lot of knowledge on the, recent warfare techniques. right? They have also knowledge of, intelligence and how do you deal, with these kind of threats, with hybrid threats. Of course, much longer, much more experience to be shared. So I think if we transition to perceiving Ukraine as an equal partner in the building European security, I think this is a much better standing point than charity. And also certainly than just seeing, this is for EU security. No, it is Ukraine's security. It is the EU and Ukraine within the European Union and its security architecture. And I think that's important to keep emphasizing, because I think otherwise the policies are not sustainable. Like the support for Ukraine in the general population, emotions to pictures and suffering. This is something that is not very long-lived.
The EU is relatively good at working with countries whose governments are highly motivated to fulfill all EU requirements. But when a ruling party rigs the elections, takes an authoritarian turn and defies the EU's recommendations, the EU has a difficult time engaging and bringing the country back on track. For example, in Georgia, the EU deplores intensifying political repression, but is struggling to provide meaningful support to civil society and to keep up hope. Does the EU use its leverage and tools sufficiently in these cases?
Again, very important question. I got a little, maybe a small anecdote, because the last weeks I had a bit more contact with EU officials, also in the Commission and some of the member states, and I very often, too often for my liking, heard that, we probably have lost Georgia now. So that there's a certain defeatism here, but also coming right to the heart of what you're suggesting is that the EU seems to have come to the conclusion that its instruments are not sufficient. But I do not agree with this view. I think that the EU could have done or should do in this context significantly more to support civil society, also support independent media. It has mechanisms for this, even if the environment is increasingly closed and autocratic, of course, also posing limitations as to how the EU can work with civil society and putting civil society and opposition in danger. But we have the European Endowment for Democracy, for example, that does great work also in these contexts. And I think there could be many more or much more resources allocated to civil society in these situations. So that's one. I think the second issue is that the EU still, it still remains in its nature and also an intergovernmental organization. And what does that mean? Right? It is very much focused on states and interacts with governments. Now that is of course easiest, and straightforward if the other government is also democratically elected. If that's not the case, the EU has a bit of a problem, because with whom does it then interact? Officially, the interaction is supposedly also, it makes its agreements, the trade agreements and so on, with governments, with states. So if a state defaults for democratic standards, there is a problem for the EU in terms of how it negotiates, how with whom it talks. And this is, there's also a lot of work that the EU is notoriously bad in responding to uprisings. Yeah, same problem. Right? They don't want to topple a government. Also supporting political opposition parties. Also that, very, very difficult. It approaches, for example, in the context of Belarus, the Belarusian opposition democratic forces in exile, they're approaching them through the lens of them being civil society organizations and NGOs, but they are not their political parties. They are the opposition. And that creates a problem. Yeah? So it's a very technocratic approach that the EU has to civil society. So that's another problem. But I also think now, that's probably going to be your next question, which I don't want to forecome. But in the context of Georgia, the EU probably had less leverage in economic terms, in political terms, than it now does in the context of Moldova, for example. And I think the Georgian government, the Georgian dream, you know much more about this than I do, has of course for a long time already, geared the country towards a more multi-vector foreign policy. Right? Also relations with the Russian Federation, economic relations with the Russian Federation, with China. Right? I mean, I don't know how many infrastructure projects there are now in Georgia, where the Chinese are building tunnels and roads and so on. The question is how long they will, last. But okay, no, but this is something that already was a long time at play, and I think that makes it. I have to be fair to the EU as well. I think that makes it also quite difficult for the EU to exert, more influence in this context. But I would again, and you know my opinion about this, I would still argue the EU could have put more pressure, also financially, in terms of financial programs and so on the Georgian.
But how is that different from the Moldovan case?
In
terms of leverage.
Yes. I mean, there's several things. For example, when it comes to the energy grid, Moldova's energy grid is fully connected to the Romanian energy grid. So to disconnect this is going to be, these are just, these are functional integrations, that we usually don't see, but they matter quite a bit. So to disconnect this, is going to be, quite difficult if there was a change now with the parliamentary elections of government. So that is one thing. There's also economic dependence. Half of the trade of Moldova is with the European Union. In the case of Georgia, this is slightly different. I mean, it used to be very Western orientated, but there is now increasingly, of course, also trade with the Russian Federation and also with China, and Turkey. And so we've seen this already for quite some time. And then, of course, the third very important factor, I would argue, is that Moldova is now, it is in the accession negotiations. It's locked in this process of accession negotiation. Of course, you can take the country out, but in the Georgian case, that hasn't really been the case. Right? There was candidacy status, but the process hadn't started. And of course, the accession comes with a lot of financial support and various, the growth program and so on and so forth. I mean, there's some serious financial assistance involved. So the EU has a bit more, more tools, more leverage, I would say.
But what do you think would happen if now in the upcoming elections in Moldova, they're coming up in autumn, Russia actually succeeds in manipulating the elections, including through large-scale vote buying? What would the EU do in that case?
I think the EU is already trying to do a bit more preventative work. I think they are, very active in, even, the Commission for Enlargement, Marta Kos, is traveling around the countryside of Moldova. Was first trying to, convince peoples in the areas that were very pro-Russian to support a more pro-European government. Don't know if that really helped. But the EU is much more aware also of the context. I think there's also support, for election monitoring and so on and so forth, more so than there was in the case of Georgia.
Is it outside of the ODA?
Yes, but exactly. So, but there's also
which is something that a lot of organizations in Brussels were asking for Georgia. Not only in Brussels. For Georgia, and that didn't happen.
Exactly, but I think there's much more. There are many more financial programs that also support independent media and election or civil society monitoring elections and so on. There's more of a spotlight, and I think then the EU also has more tools, as I just mentioned. As part of the accession process, as part of the financial assistance, as part also, not to be forgotten, agricultural produce can, without tariffs, enter the European Union. It's until 2025, so that we know for sure. And if all of these, so the EU has a lot of strings to potentially pull to, put pressure on the incoming government. I would say that I think the stakes, if Moldova was to unilateral, if these tariffs would be put back in place, potentially, that will hit hard. Also, 50% of trade that hits hard if that stops, right? So I think there are more pressure points.
And do you think this is obvious to Moldovan population?
This is hard for me to comment on. I mean, I would say it is. We always have, the part, of course, in the big cities traditionally in Chisinau, there will be more awareness amongst young people. Of course, also in the large diaspora of Moldovans abroad, they will very well know this, and they can be game changers. The diaspora is very powerful. At least that's my understanding. But of course, you still also have areas within Moldova where there's strong support for Russian Federation. There's Gagauzia and so on.
The governments of some of the candidate countries are currently not really trying to make big efforts to the EU accession. Do you think that there is a risk that the EU's relationship with some candidate countries, with Georgia, with some of the Balkan countries, might become very transactional, focused more on infrastructure development, economic integration, but leaving behind the defense of democracy?
But I think to some extent we have already seen this happening in the Western Balkans. I think that gives us a precedence to some extent. How transactionalism, as I mentioned before, critical raw materials, etc., but also strategic interests more broadly in stability, can function to support the autocratic regimes or the autocratization of regimes. Again, Serbia is the classic case at hand. At the same time, though, I mean, I should still hope that countries that find themselves in accession negotiations with the European Union are held accountable by the fundamentals chapters, for example, which cannot be closed. Until everything has been adopted and reformed and so on and so forth in these very chapters. So hopefully there is a sort of past dependency created in the enlargement process that still continues to emphasize democracy and the rule of law at the same time as member states pursuing more strategic goals, economic security in the different enlargement countries. But I am very worried that as a country like Georgia, for example, starts to pursue a multi-vector foreign policy, and increasingly we see this, also, of course, Viktor Orban and all the populist right-wing governments, they are all flirting with this idea. Oh, we are not dependent on the EU. We have loads of other partners. Sometimes that works out better than at other times. But there is a strategy here, and they are copying each other as well in this. And then they're trying to weigh these different partners and play them off against each other, and that includes the EU. And I think the EU still hasn't found a clear response to this situation, and certainly not a principled response. So I think when the geopolitical interests are at stake, the EU is more likely, to close one eye or two eyes to democracy and human rights. And as I said before, I don't think this is a credible and sustainable way. Also, not only when it comes to human rights and democracy as such, but also for stability in the long term. I mean, that was the whole, our original idea of the European project. It was, stability and security, but through establishing functioning democracies. And I think if we are moving away from this principle, I think it will erode the European Union from within. And of course, it will also, erode and counteract the enlargement process as such. And I think that will just lead to more instability in the end. But tell this to, government who usually have a time horizon of 3-4 years until the next re-election. Very difficult.
Giselle, what would be one main recommendation that you would like to give to the European Union to adapt its EU enlargement policy?
It's difficult for political scientists to just give one recommendation. Okay, but I will try. I mean, I think for me, the most important is unity. And I think this is unity among member states on issues like security, on issues also democracy and human rights, and to stand together. I think ultimately in the European Union, if this unity is lacking, I don't think we stand a chance as a community in this rapidly changing global order. So I think unity is the only survival recipe, and enlargement, I think, here is crucial, as I mentioned before, for Ukraine and Moldova to be, part of this community and be also considered equals, more than anything else, and then making this a collective security endeavor. That is our only chance. I mean, the odds are, we talked about it earlier, the odds are not speaking for the European Union at this moment in time, to defend its own security. But, if we want to stand a chance, it has to be through unity.
Thank you so much for this excellent conversation. And thank you all for watching. We will be back very soon with an interesting episode on transatlantic relations. Stay tuned.